You should take it anyway. All right, well, we were going to put Jeff in the hot seat to talk about this, but this is actually a copy of the software that I run in the lab that I maintain. There's about 46 machines in there, so I can actually talk about that and how I use it day to day and how my customers are using it. So I'll start off by kind of describing what CCS Vulnerability Manager is. It's a full-fledged vulnerability scanner. Right? And how many people in here have never used Nessus, Qualys, ISS, Nmap? Is there anybody here who's never worked with vulnerability scanners? I'm going to throw something at you, Don. Okay. You know, the basic idea, most everybody here has heard of them, is the idea of scanning systems for vulnerabilities, scanning them for configurations to expose them to somebody doing something malicious on that machine, being able to remotely exploit it, remotely make it do what they want to do. Right? This could be a result of not having a patch on the machine, having a bad configuration, having excessive permissions, having default configurations for authentication, credentials, and so forth already present on the machine. A variety of things can introduce vulnerabilities. And vulnerability scanners therefore have to maintain large vulnerability databases and have a very optimized method of scanning for those vulnerabilities. And that's what CCSVM does. We're talking about a vulnerability database. Last time I heard, the number was over 65,000 vulnerability checks. It's a massive database. It's built on top of a 64-bit platform, which gives it extra bandwidth to go out and actually complete its scans, which is a very intensive process. If anybody that's worked with the system knows that it's very memory intensive, very processor intensive, very network intensive on the machine that's doing that scan. So the system was designed from the ground up to make use of the latest platform, the latest technology. It runs on a central server, right? It's got a central console, web-based, what you see right here. And then it has a distributed system of scan engines. So essentially what a scan engine is the actual workhorse. You just put that out on a network. It could be on a remote network. When you do vulnerability scanning, you want to be able to do it at the site where the devices actually are, because you can take out a WAN pipe actually doing that scanning. So you've got distributed scan engines that you can put out. You can put them on the internet, do internet-based scans, often required for various compliance reasons, like PCI will require you to do a network-based assessment. So it gives you that flexibility. Now in my environment, I only needed one scan engine and one console. Total time to get it up and running, about an hour to build the VM that it actually ran on. You know, just go through the setup and everything, and then the actual install of the software took about 10 minutes. I had it up and scanning in 20 minutes after that. So, very, very easy platform to work from. It's designed with all the core features in mind. And as you can see, I've been actually running it for quite some time on my network across my devices. So, first off, what you do is you set up your site. And I'll give you an example of that here. I may have to log in again, actually. Oh, we're lucky. Let me log in. It does actually time you out. So basically, you define a site that you want to scan, and you associate it with two pieces of information. You associate it with what you want to scan, and you associate it with what type of scan you want to run against it. Those that work with those who haven't worked with vulnerability scanners much, you can have a scan that just does simple discovery, looking for open ports, all the way to a scan that actually attempts some unsafe checks, right? A denial of service check that would actually denial of service the box if the box was vulnerable to it. So you have a wide range of options in how intensive you want to get in the scan. And you define what devices you want. You can see some of the examples here. You can do site notation, by specifying the subnet mask. You can specify a range of devices. It also gives an example here for our website. There is web application scanning built into it as well. So it'll actually go to the site, grab the content of the site, robot down through the site, follow spider the site itself, looking for vulnerable web applications, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, a variety of web-based attacks we target against the machine. And that's how you actually get that into that. The next thing actually, this is compared to other scanners. Usually if you want to do network-based assessments, you want to do authenticated scans, you want to do web application scanning, you're going to need 2 or 3 products to accommodate all of those. Right? There's a lot of niche products that only do web application scanning and only do database scanning. So CCSVM has scans built into it for Windows, for Unix. It's got checks for Oracle, checks for SQL, checks for MySQL. It's got checks for authentication systems, network switches, routers. It's got a variety of things, along with web application scanning built into it. So, of course, you can include, or exclude devices, I guess I should say. You can exclude devices from the scan. And then you go and you define how the scan is going to run. You say what kind of scan you want to run against it, what scan engine you want to take responsibility. So if you've got that internet-based scan engine, you can assign it to that scan engine. And then you can also set up a schedule, which is what I do. I let the scan kick off every couple days at 5 o'clock in the morning and run for 300 minutes. And if the scan doesn't complete in that time, it pauses. I've got it set down here. You can see at the bottom, continue where the last scan left off. I want to go in and actually pick up that scan after that point. That's because sometimes, in a 300-minute window, it may not complete the scan. Right? There's a lot of scans. I've run into a lot of companies that hit that 24-hour window and go, wait a second now, we can't do certain types of scans every day because it's going to take the entire day for that type of scan to run on this large block of machines. Of course, the answer in this case would be to add another scan engine to complete that work. So that's the basic definition of a site. Does anybody have any questions or challenges they've dealt with on vulnerability scanning that they want to bring up now as I start to dig into some of these things?
You mentioned something about just adding another scan engine. Is that more licensing, or if you have 5 or 1, it doesn't matter?
Yeah, actually, it's one of the nice things about the licensing model. People that have looked at this will recognize portions of this interface as the Rapid7 Nextpost engine. And what we did was we licensed their engine, and then we've started building that into CCS. Now, real quick, CCS is a larger suite. It's a whole bunch of different things around compliance management. Policy, interviews, standards assessments on systems, now vulnerability scanning. Now, what we have done is undertaken a different licensing model than Rapid7 took with their product. And one of the things, like your example, is no charge for additional scan engines. Yeah, Symantec doesn't like to have complex licensing models, right? I mean, anybody who's dealt with having to, annually go in and get their new license from the license portal and attest that they're not a terrorist and not working in a nuclear environment, except for some people, right? That actually have to go in and mark off those questions. Knows that's already enough to work with. That's why, you look at CEP, you look at CSP, the license model is very simple. And this took the same situation. So we basically licensed on a number of devices that you're going to be scanning. And then on top of that, you can have the main scan engines you want.
Quick question, James. Is the vulnerability database, is it more like the CCS model where you manually update it, or is it more like the Nessus model where it automatically updates in the background?
It automatically updates in the background. Yep. Other than I only log on to the system once every week and a half. And frequently I'll log in, and the page I actually get is the news page. This comes up every now and then with updates about what's been pushed to the system as it's been downloading the new scans. So I'll click in the last notice that I got, and you'll see what they talk about. Basically everything is pushed out content-wise to the platform. New checks, feature enhancements. One time it was a big database upgrade. They moved from the backend database, for this is Postgres. They moved from Postgres 8 to Postgres 9. So I got instructions. Here's how you go through, update it to Postgres 9.
Can you configure the scans to be authenticated and then some unauthenticated?
Yes. Actually, it really is based on the check, right? Some checks are unauthenticated checks where it connects up and say it connects to a web server and sends a GET request to look for a web header. As an example, no authentication required. But it's going into a web application now, logging on and looking for a particular function in that web app that's vulnerable. That's actually going to have a username and password associated with it. And when I was on that scan setup, let me go back to that here. Right here is where I can define those credentials. So if you define a credential and there's a credential-based scan, it's going to attempt like that particular check for that credential-based scan. And the credentials it supports quite a long list, actually. I mean, even CDS. I'm expecting a lot of people have never even worked with CDS as a platform, or even Git maybe, but it supports all these different mechanisms for logging on to a system. And of course, you got 3 there that are dedicated specifically to web applications. So the webs, you got HTTP authentication would be those little pop-ups, right? Go to the website, get little pop-ups instead of your username and password. Form authentication, you go to a website and there's a form on that page you got to fill up. The nice thing is when you select that, it'll say, hey, what's the web page? You specify the web page. It pulls it up and it actually says, is this the form? Is this the username field and the password field? And then you specify the values and what to submit, and it'll actually go and log on to that website using those credentials. And session-based authentication is a little bit more extreme. That's for cases where you're going to be working with the web developer to create a custom session, or you're going to be going through a song and dance to log on to the site, get the session, and give it to CCSVM to log on. Normally, you're going to find the first 2 fit. But you see there's a variety of other platforms here we can also log on to check those systems. And that opens up all of the authenticated scans. In fact, a large amount of the good data you get comes from authenticated scans. One of the advantages in this platform is a reduction in the number of false positives. And the way that it does that, well, there's 2 mechanisms. One is there's multiple scans that are performed per vulnerability. Right? One vulnerability may actually have 4 or 5 different checks run against it to determine if that vulnerability is real. And that's one thing people like about this over some of our competing solutions out there, is that it reduces the number of false positives. Also, there's an expert system built into it. And if anyone here hasn't worked with an expert system, basically what it is a knowledge base that links multiple pieces of information together and makes deductions on its own. So we know that based upon a vulnerability in the database and a vulnerability we discovered in the operating system, we know that this operating system vulnerability is exposed. And we can report on that. It can link those together. They call it vulnerability chaining. So it's a piece of intelligence built into the software. So in short, that's how you define an actual site. This is how you say, this is what I want to scan. When you want to say what you want to scan, that's that scan template. You saw that full audit scan. Oh, that's actually a full template. Click on the right option. All right. Out of the box, there's a number of scan templates built in, and you can customize these scan templates to suit your own requirements. You have a Windows-specific scan template with only Windows vulnerabilities. You can have, the one I use is full audit. Basically launch it all at the systems and see what comes up. You can also have one specifically for web applications. And when you click on these, let's go, that last scan was set up for full audit, so why don't we take a look at the full audit template. You have a lot of options. One important option is how you discover devices. So you can define what process you want to take to find devices on your network. You want to just ping, and if the machine doesn't respond to ping, don't try to add it. You want to just try to hit a few ports on that machine to determine, because maybe it doesn't answer ping, but it'll answer SSH. That's how you know that the system is live. This is for discovery purposes. This only says, hey, there's a machine out on the network. At that point, it fingerprints the machine to find out what operating system the machine is running, runs a number of checks against it to fine-tune that information, and then runs additional scans against it. And the next step, of course, is to discover what services are running on that machine. Once we know the machine is out there, how do you want to scan that machine for services? And you can control that option. For example, right now I've got this set up for a SYN scan. It does a SYN, and if it gets a SYN-ACK, it's going to know that that port is active. You can do SYN reset, SYN fin, you can do full connect scans, all these types of options that you see right here. And you can control what ports it's going to look for. You know, obviously a well-known port scan is going to happen faster, but there's times when you want to actually check all 65,535 possible port numbers. So you have that option to set that. So you define those 2 pieces of information. You define your site and your scan template, you link them together, and that's going to give you a report. But before I jump to the report, I want to highlight these options along the left right here. Fine-tune how this policy is going to behave. For example, database servers. You can define what type of connections to make. You know, if it gets to a Postgres database, do you want to use template 1, or maybe template 0, or maybe a specific database? If you go to connect to an Oracle box, maybe you have an Oracle policy file, which your Oracle DBAs have defined. Well, you can scan using the requirements of that Oracle policy file. So you have the ability to define that within the interface. All of these, like web spider in here, that's going to say when you connect up to a website, how am I going to dig through that website? Am I going to honor robots.txt, the file that tells search engines not to hit certain parts of the site? Probably a good idea because web applications can be pretty sensitive if you don't know where you're getting into on them. So you might want to honor that. You may want to define how fast it's going to scan the website. Like I was just actually talking to Don. In my environment, I don't have that web application scan scheduled because it absolutely dominates my web server. The load average goes through the roof. And that's because I haven't gone in here and broken out how fast I want it to scan. Right? I need to slow the scan down for the web server. So it allows you to tweak that and fine tune it so that it performs properly in your environment. Any questions on that before I jump into the actual output? Well, once you actually get done running a scan, and I'll show you the scan results here from mine. So this is the entire lab environment that I have. And I have a variety of systems in this lab. So it shows a unique blend. It gives you an output of everything that it found. So there's the first page of output, the first list of systems, what it identified, the name of the system, the platform the system is running. So we got some ESXi boxes, we've got some generic Linux, which is actually Gen 2. We've got CentOS listed up there, some Windows boxes. All right, we've got a Windows workstation here, which is actually the machine I'm connected to right now. So then you've got the actual output of what exploits, what vulnerabilities it found. And you notice it breaks these into two categories, right? A vulnerability is just a count for how many vulnerabilities were discovered on the machine. Exploit is the count of how many of those vulnerabilities as exploitable. Now the way that it determines that is that this is linked to the Metasploit database. Is anybody in here not familiar with Metasploit? Okay, a couple people. So let me explain real quick what it is. Metasploit is a pen tester's tool, right? It is a tool for going out and actually running exploits against a system, where you can specify the type of exploit, you can load that exploit from a database, launch it, and actually see the results in that time, gain remote access to a system. So what this is telling you is not only is the vulnerability present on the machine, but there's an exploit in the Metasploit database that can be run against that machine. So let's take, let's grab this guy, he's a SQL box, why not? So some basic information about it, you can tell that it is a virtual machine. You can determine that from the MAC address alone. You can see the scan history of that device, and then you get a list of the vulnerabilities broken down into critical, severe, and moderate vulnerabilities. So obviously the critical ones are going to be highest on the list. And you can see along the left here the risk score associated with it. This is added up to compute the risk score of the machine. Personally, I find it a lot easier to identify which systems I need to patch fastest by looking at the risk score associated with it. And keeping that risk score low, that's always what my goal is, just tuning these systems. And of course, along the left, you've got vulnerability definition, which is actually a link to the vulnerability. Like if I click on this one here, this will take me into the database to show me what this vulnerability is about, any specific references to it that I should know about, and the Metasploit module. You can actually click on this and get information about where to go and get that particular Metasploit module. Actually, that's taken you to the Metasploit website. So there's that link to the Metasploit database itself.
What about remediation recommendations?
The remediation information right here. So you've got a link to Microsoft's advisory on this, the remediation information. And various, obviously in certain vulnerabilities you'll get a variety of information. Sometimes it'll be a link to a patch. Sometimes it'll be instructions about how to correct a configuration. It'll vary depending on the actual vulnerability. This happens to be I think it was Office. Yeah, it's Office, so this is going to be a Microsoft patch. Now, of course, you can look at it from this, oh, and actually before I jump onto it, I'll cover two things here. Exceptions. This happens to me actually on CentOS a lot because the database is great with back-ported patches on Red Hat, SUSE, and the main enterprise supported platforms. CentOS has a tendency to have a different list associated with it, so I do run into a lot of false positives with back-ported patches on CentOS. Right? Where back-porting a patch basically means we run a vulnerable version of this application, but we have changed it so that it won't exhibit that particular behavior. Right? We've taken the fix and we back-ported it into an older version. They do this for compatibility reasons, so that you can support an enterprise environment. Red Hat, SUSE, you don't see much trouble with that, with back-ported patches. But if you do have one, like for example, this one for Office, maybe for some reason I can't change Office on this machine. Well, I can go in here and define that as an exception. I don't want to mark this against my risk score. I don't want to mark this as a vulnerability on the system for a specific reason. And I can select amongst multiple reasons, and I can document why that is not a vulnerability in my mind. Right? For example, maybe I'm using CSP on the system, and that would protect against that vulnerability. And I can't patch it because it's Windows NT, and there's no patch out there for it. Random example, right? But I can say there's compensating control, it's CSP, and document that information. The other piece of the pie, when you actually get that report, is the ability to open a ticket. So I can go in here and create a ticket with, this is all stored within the ticketing system within CCSVM, where I can document who's responsible for that ticket, what they need to do with it, which vulnerabilities they need to fix, right? I can give that ticket a name. And I can go in here and select the vulnerabilities off that list, maybe select all of them, right? That I want them to be responsible for. And then that person will be notified that they need to go out and correct that vulnerability on that system.
Seems kind of manual, assigning remediation steps. Can you assign it by a host? So OXP goes to the engineering group, or?
Actually, right before I came here, that was the exact conversation I was having. We were on a call with one of our customers in Des Moines, and we had one of our workflow partners on the phone. And CCSVM, the next thing was, the whole system has an API associated with it. Pretty much anything that it does, there is an API called through a RESTful web-based API. So the nice thing about workflow is it natively works with web-based APIs. Therefore, workflow can take what this is doing and build any process around it. A system is scanned, a vulnerability is found. Create a ticket for that system, assign it to this user. That user can then reassign it or divvy it up, or maybe based on the system, look in this database table, the list of systems and who owns them. Maybe talk to CCS, which actually has an asset system built into it that tracks that information. And whoever's listed as the custodian of CCS, assign that ticket to that person. They get an email notification, they can go in, look at it, fix it, then they mark it as closed, and then this goes in and automatically rescans that system. If they said it was closed and it was resolved, let's rescan it. So we were just having a detailed call about how to accomplish that with workflow. Completely doable. We even have examples similar to that on workflow SWAT. And this partner is going to work to develop this for this particular customer, their custom process. Cool. So from that view, then I can also go in here. That's a site-based view. I said, pull up the site, show me everything in that site. I can also go in and pull it up based upon specific parameters, like the operating system of the machine. So if I want to go in here and look at my ESXi boxes, I can click on that. I get a list of all the boxes that were identified to be running ESXi, list of vulnerabilities and exploits, and I can start digging into that. Of course, I can also build groups of systems. Like on the home page, down below here, if I scroll down, you'll see that I broke out some of these platforms. I've got a list of web servers. So this is any machine that's running on port 80, a service on port 80 or 443. I labeled that a web server. Any machine that's running Linux, obviously I have more Linux assets than Windows assets, so you got a longer list there. But you can create groups and then report based upon those groups. And you can assign access to different devices, different assets, based upon who the user is. It's a multi-user system. My use case, it really wasn't necessary because I'm the only person that logs onto the system. So. I guess the only other piece here to show is probably the reporting interface. What kind of questions? Anybody got any questions or going in line right now?
I want to understand how you implement this relative to either multiple tenancy or role-based visibility.
Okay. For multiple tenancy, there's not really a division in the database. You're going to need another console to support that. You have to silo it.
Or role-based.
Now, role-based, you can break up access to the different assets and reports based upon the user that's coming in. And you can authenticate them via Active Directory. So that's an option. Now, it still puts everything in the same repository. So if those users shouldn't have access to each other's site data, you need to make sure they're not administrative users and that site data is locked down to the specific users that need that access.
I want to also understand is, from what I saw originally in one of your first tables, you showed that it looks to me like the key is based off IP address, right? But unfortunately, we all know that most of our machines have a number of IP addresses associated with them, and a lot of them go through different F5s or whatever front ends, and we want to really get it back to the back end server. So is there a functionality to allow aliasing amongst the IP addresses so you know that all of these internet-facing IP addresses that go through the different interfaces end up with vulnerability of that?
Yep. Now, if the two machines, if it's multi-home and it exhibits the behavior of two separate machines, we're going to treat it like two separate machines. But if a machine has multiple names associated with it, we can tie that information together. In my environment, I don't believe I have multiple names, so I can't show
It's
it to you.
pretty common in scanners that they have two different IP addresses.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you see, here's our problem. That we get into situations where we'll have like 10 different IP addresses, but actually really result in really one vulnerability. And we don't really want to remediate 10 incidences of it. We want to remediate the one.
So there's a couple ways you can deal with that. One is that you can exclude the IP addresses that you know are multi-home machines. Right? Just like I did, you saw a couple of exclusions in my site setup where I said, I don't want to scan these. That was because those actually one of those devices is an HP printer, a little scanning fax device that is never going to get patched. In fact, I have to reboot the thing every now and then. So it's a device that's never going to get fixed. So I excluded it. You can do the same thing with your multi-home devices. Right? Fine, I don't want to scan these IPs, just scan this one. That's really easy to set up. Another option is that when you create that ticket, you can create it for multiple devices. So you can say, you know, I want all instances of this ticket created, or this vulnerability created on this one ticket.
But we have that knowledge about all that out.
Yes. Yes. And without that knowledge, I would just recommend excluding that address. It's the easiest solution.
But it may be repurposed.
If it's repurposed, well, you could use workflow to actually create a process for managing devices coming in and out.
However, that is not within our control, so I'm not sure that.
Yeah. A couple other options within, and I'm trying not to get into all of our other products. I actually cover about 4 different products in this context, but one of them, CCS Standards Manager, does have the ability to start tracking individual assets, where they are, what their compliance requirements are, and you can have that feed CCS VM's scanning engine, and have that data be used as a mechanism to say, okay, we need to scan this host and then pull that data back in. That's the long-term vision actually for bringing this engine for the whole reason we licensed the Nextpulse engine and put that into CCS was to get to that point. Right now we've got this feeding web-based dashboards. So you can do a web-based dashboard showing all this great data and have that set up the management and so forth. You can go down that road, and now you're managing from a controls perspective as opposed to the tactical, I found a system, I want to scan it. Right? Just because the system's out there doesn't mean you got to scan it. in this context. I want to know how specific systems that have compliance requirements are meeting those requirements, and put the control the other direction.
Okay, thank you very much, I appreciate it.
You have touched briefly on reports. Does this product allow you to, you go in as James and set everything up and tweak everything, and then just make an account where, somebody would just go in on a Friday and run a report on it and not have access to do anything but run the report?
Sure.
So those kinds of things.
Yeah, basically, actually the reporting mechanism, which is kind of the last thing that I think is really on my list for this discussion. Let's take an example here. I ran an executive summary report. So this is your pretty graph report. It'll pop up in a second here. So this is an HTML output. I could have this output as a PDF. I could have it emailed to whoever needed it.
Could you have it automatically run?
Yes.
Oh,
You can schedule it to run and automatically email this report to a specific person.
nice. Okay.
As I scroll down here, you get all the great charts and graphs and happy information that is applicable to your environment. Yeah, and you've got a variety of reports. You can do remediation reports, you can do asset-based reports, like I want to report on this one asset. PCI reports, it's a common report that we have to run. We got customers that buy it specifically to cover PCI compliance. And also baseline reports, which is, this is the report that I had last time, this is the report I have now, run a baseline of that, tell me what's different.
Is it just PDF and HTML, or is it XLS and that or something?
Actually, let me pull it up here.
Yeah, you can do qualis, you can do quite a few.
Jump out of CSV in case.
USB.
Yeah, actually, you see one there that says SIM. That's actually a report I'm generating just for our SIM product. Here's our report formats.
I heard one where there's the time lapse where it's basically looking at baselines. Here's where it was here, and here's where it is now. But you could do one where you pick a machine and say, well, here's how it's improved over, or deproved, I guess, over 5 months, bang, bang, bang.
Trend analysis?
Yeah.
Not so much that. Yeah, I don't think there's a trend analysis. Now, in actually, I should correct that. The web-based dashboards in CCS do trend analysis, so they would be able to generate a report like that. But it's another product. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's a module of the same product. Control Compliance Suite is made up of Vulnerability Manager, Standards Manager, Response Assessment Module, Entitlements Module, Policy Module. So, and of course the web-based dashboards sit on top of all that. So this is one that can report into that along with the other modules, and that can give you your trend analysis. Much similar to what you saw on the home page when I logged on there and showed over the last year that I've been running this, how it's...
Some of the graph there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's a number of different options here that you can output to. One of them that I set up, like I said, I did one for SIM, and what it actually does is, for those who are in SIM in here, it will take that vulnerability list and populate the vulnerability portion of the asset table. It'll create the assets in the asset table, populate the vulnerabilities, and then you can use your rules to say, is the system vulnerable? So that's a pretty cool feature. If anybody wants to see that before I shut the system down, I can pull up my SIM and actually show that. But yeah, so you got your options along here for the scheduling of it and the distribution of it. Here's where I schedule it. Here's where I set up distribution for it. So that's pretty much the process. You define a site, link it to a scan template, run the scan, generate a report.
This probably alludes to what Pete was talking about too, but can you take the one scan engine and have 2 or 3 different interfaces that monitor different segments, or would that just require another scan engine?
You can just set up another site for that.
Okay.
Yeah, you could have one scan engine and scan multiple sites.
Okay.
That's actually what I do. I only have one scan engine here, but I've got a site defined for my full system network scan, and I've got a web-based scan, which just goes after, there's a handful of web servers hosted in that environment, and it will go through and scan those web applications. I just specify the URL. I break it out into 2 sites because I want to use a different scan template. That's the only reason, right? The actual 2 systems, Pala and Nord, which host all those web servers, right? Or the 2 web servers and then the websites, they get scanned on the network-based policy. So it connects up, does the authenticated scans to 2 Unix boxes, does the vulnerability checks there, but it doesn't actually hit port 80. The web services scan actually hits port 80. and goes through and connects to all the different pages and looks for vulnerable web applications.
Yeah, I have PCI networks, so I have separate scan engines for like in Muncie, and in SunGuard I'll have separate, so I've got like 4 engines altogether. It's all controlled by the one console. There's one, you go into the one console, we sell scheduling from within that one console.
So you can have 4 different engines and you can manage it from one spot, get all the reports into that one spot.
It all comes back to this one.
Okay, nice. Yeah.
So any other questions in the room? Oh, we said time. Then out.
Well, we cover some stuff again.
And does anybody want to see the SIM piece that I talked about, that data feed? I know we got a couple of SIM users in here. Nobody's saying no, so. We'll pull that up real quick. Of course, my SIM's working.
Give me some Red Bull.
What's that?
So give me some Red Bull over there. I gotta work out.
Just every once in a while, slam something down.
You can, but I personally choose to run this under Linux. And it's really just a performance perspective. I see less overhead and build a real stripped down little box to run this in a Linux environment. But we do support Windows as well as a platform, 64-bit. Yeah. We do have a 32-bit component for it, but I really don't recommend running it. It was built for legacy customers, and 32-bit puts in a very large resource constraint. And it just sticks us back in the boat where we're dealing with the same kind of platform that your Nessuses and your Wallaces and all those have been built on top of.
Is it Sanger?
I gotta download the updated concept.
Here's the Sanger? It's 1 o'clock.
Well, it could be here. We had a water leak a month ago and it came right through the ceiling.
Awesome. Wow. Was it groundwater or was it?
People moved out of the 13th floor and we don't know who turned the water on.
Oh, gee. Oh.
Probably being foreclosed on. Side of trash the place. Yeah, I'm in the housing market now, so I've been seeing that stuff.
I think there's still some buildings in downtown that don't have 13th floors. That the old superstition is that you didn't always go to the Yeah. We used to do that too. Not so much. Well, maybe she doesn't have it.
I would expect that to be one of the buildings. It's one of the older ones.
Yeah.
I'm actually updating the console right now because I patched the server, but I never patched my my workstation's console. This only takes a second.
This is an opportunity for you to illustrate how easy it is to patch the console.
Indeed. Yep. Kind of nifty install. It's a little different. It's not your typical MSI kind of installer, Yeah, the overall theme, and I'll say this isn't just in my products, but all of our products, has been integration. And I really see that coming along since Enrique Salem took over. I mean, he's been pushing that agenda with his management, and they've been pushing that agenda to make more of our software work together, take advantage of things. And you see it all over the place, like on DLP. You start seeing DLP sending notifications to CCS, so now all of a sudden you have content-aware controls. DLP found cardholder data on this system. CCS automatically flags as a PCI system and runs that assessment. Actions like that. You see Semantic Protection Center, SPC, with its integration over console management between a variety of these different platforms. you see our push for workflow, right? We had a dedicated team of systems engineers that sold workflow. Well, now workflow is available to any customer that has an enterprise product from Symantec. You own SEP, you own DLP, you own CCS, you own CSP, you own one of those products, you're entitled to run workflow in your environment. Now, what do those people do that used to sell the product? They're writing workflows. They're going out and working with customers on workflow requirements, defining requirements, generating new workflows, a variety of activities that are being generated as a result of that. And now we're seeing workflows that are integrating SEP with SIM. We're seeing CSP and DLP and everything being all tied together. So it's a pretty cool time for integration. And this is another integration. This one doesn't use workflow, but it is a good example of integration where SIM has a rule-based system for triggering on log activity, log management. And one of the components to it is an asset database that can track what assets are sending logs into the environment. Well, now, with CCS/VM scanning those assets, you can have CCS/VM automatically populating that database. You don't need to see all the dashboards pop up. I didn't create this list right here. This all came out of CCS/VM, with the exception of a few of those devices were created in another interface. That's why you see the MAC address on there. But what you have here is a system that it's automatically gone through, scanned the assets that are out there, the IP address, if there's associated host name on it, and then it's gone in and it's documented which services are running on that machine, right? And it's documented any vulnerabilities associated with that machine. Now in my rules, I can write a rule that says, I only want to trigger this rule around web applications attacks if the machine that's actually being targeted by it is a web server. If it's not a web server, I really don't care, right? Well, now I have a means to actually know if there's a web server running on that system. CCS/VM tells SIM, these are the services in place. I can check port 80, port 8080, 8080, 443, 8443, and I can document that list and say, if that service isn't listing on that machine, I'm not going to trigger this rule. So it allows you to add a whole new level of insight to the operation. So a great little piece of integration. And you can see actually right there where that feed came from, discovered by. I think these others, these came from SEP, if I'm not mistaken. Right, Tom, hit it! Nice segue. I love dance.
You're going to have to do two music.
So, any other questions? Now, is anybody facing any particular problems right now with vulnerability scanning that they'd love to share with the room? We see a lot of reasons for customers displacing their current scanners. Actually, I would say a large percentage of the CCS/VM opportunities are actually displacements of other scanning technologies. Yep.
Well, I'd like to ask Jeff here, as a user of this, how much time do you spend, analyzing, sitting in front of the console, looking?
Not that much. Now that I've got it, like what you're doing right here, where you're sucking it into the SIM. So the actual reports, I don't even look at anymore. I'm within Vulnerability Manager. I just go into the SIM, and then I can also generate. I've got it broken up. My different LAN administrators, I have them with each of their own sites, so they can go into the site and look and see how their network, and then they can push the patches to their actual individual machines. So from an overview, for PCI, this is nice because it does track all the vulnerabilities for you. You're already getting all that stuff into the SIM, and along with all the logging. So we actually purchased the Vulnerability Manager, the SIM that you're looking at here, CSP and SEP, and the web gateways, and they all feed to this thing. And then the vulnerabilities, third one down there, incidents, I guess it is, will pop up, and anytime that it correlates any of those different things into an incident, it'll actually pop it up there for you. But it's fairly nice. This is the console I spend most of my time in.
I'm so glad you could make it.
Yeah.
I have a question in regards to vulnerability and remediation of vulnerability. detected a vulnerability, and you are starting the process of remediation via your workflow or whatever. Right. What my point comes into is there are lots of activities happening on this unknown to us, including they may be going through a patch cycle because they only patch SQL once a year. So that might resolve that vulnerability. Now what happens to that pending action once you have scanned it and it no longer sees that vulnerability? What happens to those remediation efforts? Do you just is there some way of saying that, oh, well, this are, all the actions we have initiated for this remediation process is no longer valid because we no longer see that vulnerability? I just want to understand how you deal with that philosophy, because we're wrestling with that.
Yeah. You know, it is kind of a business procedural question to some extent. I will tell you what I have done in this environment. Maybe Jeff's got some thoughts there too, but that line right there is almost, I'd say 99% from patching, the ups and downs. I mean, you can see when I went in there, I added some, patched some, added some new system, patched some, added some, patched some, and it kind of goes up and down. And that's all been, that hasn't been me opening tickets. That's just been me scanning the system again. So if the vulnerability disappears from the system, they install the patch, and the vulnerability managed, you're going to see that number go down.
Yeah, but what may happen with that work stream now of the previously detected vulnerability that you're trying to process?
From what perspective are you talking
You've
about?
already opened up a ticket on the vulnerability to be detected.
That's just closed out.
It just automatically closes out?
Yep.
Does it send a notification to people
Does it-
working
yeah,
on
does it
it
send a
so that they
notification?
stop?
I don't believe it does. No.
Okay, so that's kind of the same as last week. If we rescan it, we don't see it, then we gotta think it's vulnerability.
Now, I would say that that's a pretty fair assessment unless you need the workflow and life cycle for compliance reasons. And if you do, you can use CCS to document that.
We do it in more of an implied process that we don't see it anymore, so therefore we must assume actions were taken to resolve it, even though they may not have.
But you document that in no case.
Well, we don't always know, that happens until we get the next scan.
Yeah. And the truth is, I can't think of a requirement within NIST or ISO. There could be. I'd have to look at more detail to see if you're required to document situations like that. But PCI doesn't require it. It doesn't say, thou shalt run a vulnerability program and document vulnerabilities that you fix for later assessment.
No, they just require you to do it within 30 days, which
Yeah.
basically if you look at what we get out of this reporting, is every Patch Tuesday, the thing spikes because suddenly Microsoft put out 50 patches, and then the next time that you run it, then it comes back down again because we patched those. And it depends, those lines look like that. That's just because it's on a monthly basis. The other ones that you're going to get are Adobe Flash, Adobe Reader, Java, and all that stuff is, so you may have vulnerabilities of 20,000 one day, and then they'll go back down to 1,000 the next patch.
So patch has to be moved also, right?
Yeah, all that this is doing is just giving you, this is what I've got on the machines. It also reports all of the products. I don't think it do anything to show it, but it shows all the software that's on the machines.
I saw Adobe Flash and stuff.
Yeah. Because if you look at the asset itself, you see the software, and it'll give you a listing of all the software that's installed right down to the drivers. So you can actually see it's got a Broadcom NIC in it or Intel.
Jeff, are you scanning workstations with this too?
I'm scanning workstations because we're PCI. We're mostly workstations. I've got a few servers, but mostly workstations are keying in credit cards. So you need to make sure you don't have keyloggers, and part of the PCI part of it is making sure that you're patched and all that sort of stuff.
And you think it does a good job coming back with Adobe Reader with Flash?
It's almost overly because it gives every Adobe. So like this last time we scanned clean, the next time I had 31 for each machine that had Adobe Player on it, Flash. So it looked and it found 31 different vulnerabilities for one patch for Flash. So if you run that patch, all 31 clean up.
So the scanner database all of a sudden gets all these updates for all these things that each individual, like Microsoft, oh, we've got all this patch, the scanner database gets updated, so then all of a sudden, all these systems will get notified.
Right.
And then your patch cycle will go through, and then those.
And you go, so
And
yeah, it's
with-
definitely not one of these deals.
And with Adobe, you've got one patch, but it might be addressing 31 so-called vulnerabilities.
And it does give the CVE for each individual one.
Yeah.
So if you want, it's almost too much information, I'd rather see just apply the one patch and be done with it. It tells you every CVE.
So I think the reason why they're doing that now is because it used to be when you'd have a scanner, you'd have to go to 28 different places. to look.
Exactly.
So now they're like, at least putting it all in one spot.
Right.
Yeah, so.
And it also does Mozilla Fire, so I mean, it does, you know, it's not just Microsoft. Although you could run a template just looking for Microsoft patches, and then it would be a little bit cleaner. It wouldn't give you effective